Hi, my name is Benet Davetian again, and this is Lecture 4 in the Sociology of Organizations. The title of this lecture and the chapter is Culture in Organizations. Again, Understanding Organizations by Howard Loon, an excellent clear text. Please read it carefully as you watch these videos, because I'm basically giving you the summary, the outline form, and it is good to get text clearly and specifically. I ended the last lecture by talking about the organizational culture, the culture of organizations, and this lecture will be about that. Have you heard the statement, somebody's a workaholic? Everything they do is invested in their job. You could say that I am an alcoholic. Those of you who know me maybe have picked up on this. My main interest is how to teach courses that are engaging, that somehow attract the interest of students and are grounded in reality, and how to do research that is not just abstract, not to do with life, but things that are relevant. Those of you who have not taken courses from me or may not have visited my website, it's on the outline. You'll see the books I've published. They're about topics that are of concern, like civility. I have a 600-page book on civility, tracing civility from the 1200s all the way to today in 3 countries. It took 8 years to put together. But I learned a lot. I wanted an excuse to study art, politics, history, and everything else. And by choosing that particular subject, I managed not to only study sociology, but a lot of other interesting topics which really inform my teaching. It's been of great, great help. I could talk nonstop for 48 hours, and it's all because of the practice of that plus other professions. It mentions in the outline that, and I'll be referring to this, that I've worked in the advertising industry at various levels of management, including top management of supervising 5-6 different advertising agency offices, and I will be telling you a few stories from there when we get talking about dysfunctional organizations. The professional investment of people in their jobs and the discovery of commitment is the major management discovery of our age. Motivation is the big buzzword. How do we motivate staff, workers? How can we have a mechanism or an ideology or an emotion that drives the individual from inside the individual rather than a whip that's applied from the outside? Ford complained that lower workers were not as motivated as higher workers, which made sense. The higher workers had better salaries and were also more part of the group that managed the company, so they had more power, more control, and therefore they felt more involved. In 1957, just passingly to mention him, William H. White wrote of junior managers who had so over-identified with their job as to have left home spiritually as well as physically to take the vows of organizational life. This man was very smart. He wrote this in 1957. The generation in the 50s, baby boomers, by the way, their parents were the 50s generation. Their main complaint was that their fathers were never home, that their fathers overworked. The idea of the organizational man, the person who sells his soul to the organization and then devotes all his energies, his entire sense of self, comes from the organization, is a creation of the 50s, and it is really the beginnings of that word, workaholic. But families were set up that way. The man could work and arrive late at night. Most of the women did not work, and the family was their responsibility. Now, the values and norms of a culture are the pillars of workers' commitment to their jobs. So when you study organizations as a culture, we're really asking what are the values of the workers and how do these contribute to the success of the organization. And the community that these values come from is also very apparent within those organizations we are studying. If you go to France, for example, you cannot tell workers to have a 30-minute lunch. The lunch, the consumption of food in France, is so very important. They would rather work later but have that proper and long lunch. It's a cultural value, it becomes a social value, and then it becomes an organizational value, and then the practice. If you want to motivate them, you have to allow that to happen. So, how do these contribute to the success of the organization? These little details that are so important. Now, Max Weber, in his body of work, come think of it, studied the Protestant ethic of the original Protestants in the spirit of capitalism. And he said that the original Protestants, because they did not enjoy the confessional of the Catholics, you couldn't go to a priest and confess and then start all over next week. No. The Protestant was believed to be damned coming into the world, born of sin, and there were no guarantees that you would be saved by God. A priest could not intercede. You could speak to your minister, get strength and all that, but the minister could not say, I will pray for you. The minister could not tell you, go say a few prayers, a few Hail Marys, and you'll be forgiven. That is why Protestant came into being. Luther and Calvin did not agree on the Catholic idea that your sins could be just forgiven like that through prayers or through repentance in the moment. What they believed in was that every person had a calling, and that the only way you could get God's grace, and God's grace was not guaranteed, by the way, very difficult religion, was by working very hard. Working hard, refusing pleasures, leading an ascetic life. And Weber notices that with time, they worked so hard that there was a surplus. I mean, if you need 10 potatoes to survive, but you work so hard that you produce 20, well, what are you going to do with the other 10? You take them to market and sell them. Now you got the money from 10 extra potatoes. What are you going to do with that money? Well, I don't know. Let's buy some more land, Mom. What do you think, Ma? Yeah, let's do it, Pa. All right, so you buy some more land. Now you make more potatoes. Now you got 40 potatoes. You only need 10 to live. You got a surplus of 30. Are you seeing the Trump Towers developing here? Little by little by little, Protestantism becomes the engine of capitalism. That's Max Weber's brilliant thesis. I've added something else to it in my book. I've said that consumerism required the yearning that comes when something's forbidden. Because in Protestantism, you were forbidden the pleasures, you had to work, a deep yearning accumulated, which then could explode in consumerism and facilitate capitalism. So it wasn't just surplus, you had to desire the products too. But the idea of a calling, the idea of a hard worker, is really what fuels the modern corporation when they speak of commitment. So they have to ask, what do workers want? If you want workers to work hard, you can't start out saying, oh, workers, they just don't want to work. No, you have to say, what do workers want? Well, this worker wants a little sip of tea. There's not much left. Feels better. What do workers want? They have to identify the company as their group rather than a workstation. The organizational man or woman who somebody wrote a book called One Dimensional Man and criticized these corporate types that lived for their jobs and agreed with everything that the corporation said. You see this in some of the series, by the way. Blue Bloods, the story of a family of New York policemen. You see this absolute commitment to a calling, to protecting the public and being a police officer. You've got the superintendent, the dad, and then it goes all the way down, and the daughter is the public prosecutor. And it's a very deep show because you see that commitment is presented as a moral imperative. It's not just something to keep you busy. It is a moral, almost a religious duty. So despite the monotony of work can be very monotonous. I mean, I can write a story, I write fiction too. I can write a story in, say, 2 days, 2 evenings, and it'll take me 3 months to edit that story, to go through it and fix and change and fix and change, and constant tinkering, and it can get very monotonous. Printing it, proofreading it again and again and again. What kind of commitment do you need to bring energy into the work you're doing and, by extension, into the organization? Theory X, which is based on suspicion, says, people will avoid work. You need to really control it. Theory Y, which I subscribe to myself, says, no, people are already motivated. You have to ask yourself, what are we doing that is destroying their motivation? How are we demotivating them and stop doing whatever it is that is demotivating people? So commitment is based on rational as well as non-rational needs. A lot of people really are looking for daddy, mommy in a company. They need that, to feel that they're like kids being taken care of and complimented. We're not all adults. Come on, I'm not an adult. Right now, I'm not in the time of my life playing with my gadgets. Look, I'm getting paid to play with an iPad. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that beautiful? And then I'll get paid to play with the editor, which I like a little less. But you see what I'm talking about? The people require this kind of organizational culture. We go back to that phrase again. That organizational culture that is protective, that is motivating, that is creatively permissive. That's the word. Creatively permissive. Who can I refer to here that Robert Merton, the greatest American sociologist to have lived. Everything we use in sociology has a connection to Robert Merton. He spoke of the unanticipated impact of everything on everything else. Unintended consequences. Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, has picked up on this and almost made it part of his very important central theories. And an Italian philosopher in the 1600s, I so found out doing research for my book, had already used the word, but we need the modern version, we need things to be said over and over and over again. The unintended consequences, the skills that you develop in a bureaucratic setting cause the dying off of other skills. Let's take me, for example. The unintended consequences of the fact that I can speak and write and teach, I think with fair facility. If you're understanding this, then it's successful. It's because it's easy for me. has a big opportunity cost. The unintended consequences is that you do not want to trust me with a nail and a hammer, let alone a skill saw. If there is a way to bring the entire house collapsing, all I need is a nail and a hammer. I cannot fix anything. I cannot build furniture. I am useless in the do-it-yourself sections. I have to take somebody there with me. So I'm a cripple in that department. But give me a book, I can go through it and summarize it for you in half an hour, a weekend, depending on the book, right? So the unintended consequences of this kind of bureaucratic culture of commitment is loss of presence in other areas of life. The present generation, the millenniums as they're called, are seeking a more balanced life. Some people say they're not motivated. That's not it. They have watched their parents and the parents of their parents who did nothing but work, and they're going, no, work is work, fun is fun. You go see Star Wars. I haven't seen it yet. Went the other night, innocent me thinking I'd get a ticket. And we have a different attitude. But it is still based on commitment to different areas. The commitment is still there. So we have a new kind of organization culture coming in. So bureaucracy can become a culture. The over-conforming that was there in the 50s, my goodness. Talk about the color of shirts. Now remember, I worked in advertising. Everybody was wearing white shirts. Then us creative types, this when the, Beatles and all these people that showed up, started wearing colorful shirts. Then we started leaving our hair long, and we sort of distinguished ourselves from what we used to call the suits, the businessmen who present the work that we would create. I would create commercials. I still have two that are still running. I won't mention them, but I don't get paid. I was in salary. We became the nonconformists. The whole Cultural Revolution was based on a very clear demarcation between the yes sir, yes man, yes woman that worked in the corporation and the creative people that wanted to change culture and change the business and the ways of doing business. I remember I would ask the owner of our company, who was in his late 60s, why we can't change this and do it this way. And he'd say, and they all had very deep voices, it's strange. I think to be a man you have to talk like the real deep people. Anyways, and they were drunk all the time. Whiskey in the office, everywhere, smoking. Watch Mad Men, you get a good idea. And his answer, every time I would suggest a change, and I was pretty high up, the vice president in charge of creative services, he'd say, Ben, we've been doing it like this for 25 years. And I felt like saying, but I was scared, didn't want to lose my job. I felt like saying, well, maybe you've been doing it wrong for 25 years. Or maybe it worked for 25 years, but it doesn't work anymore. And this was really the battle between the hard sell in advertising and the softer, more creative approach. The hard sell was, Tide will clean your clothes, buy Tide today while quantities last. The clean approach was a woman looking at the wash and wondering why the clothes had ended up in the dryer when they were in the cupboard. See, they're so clean, she can't understand that they just got washed. These are new. Yeah, something like that, right? The best ad I've ever seen came from Britain, and that launched a whole revolution. It was a picture of a man, silhouette, sideways. He's standing, side shot, and he's pregnant. Pregnant male. And the headline said, would you be more careful if it was you? Brilliant. Or the Volkswagen ads. Think small. Tiny Volkswagen. Empty page. Now these guys were, they love filling the page with copy. So all these changes were happening by the 20-year-olds. I was 20 when I worked in the business. And it was really a war between the agreeable, one-dimensional, corporate, loyal, but almost like a dinosaur worker, and the new workers that were coming in with new ideas. It was quite a time to live in. But that old culture had been based on the idea that good workers are going to decrease their personal values, their desires, and their own imaginations and defer to the corporation, the institution. The questions that were raised in the late 50s, early 60s, and especially came to a head in the early 70s, were philosophical. What kind of people had we all become? What did we value? And the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s questioned all of this. Like, receptionists had to be receptive. Yeah? Because they had to constantly demonstrate their loyalty to this invisible corporation. Or if the company was really small, to the owners. Depends on how much staff you have, right? The smaller you were, the more importance the owners took. The organization had become institutionalized, taken for granted, and people were its property. Things were done that way. In fact, when the youngsters who were creating this revolution came of age, like just after 18, 19, 20, Hollywood didn't know what kind of movies to produce for them. They were lost. Hollywood, with its old romance movies and all that, did not know how to produce movies. And what saved them were the young people themselves. People like Martin Scorsese, Al Pacino. I don't know if you know these people, but they're all great actors and directors. Robert De Niro. They went to the studios, Robert Redford, and said, look, leave it up to us. We know these kids. We're ones with them. We happen to be trained in film. We'll give you back your industry. And they pretty well saved the big studios because they were completely lost. They didn't know what to do. There was that generation gap. And that generation gap was the gap in which the conflicts in the organization, the question of what is appropriate organizational behavior, came up and had to be answered. How do you have well-organized institutions and organizations? How can they be created more quickly and more to human needs? Right? And how can we evaluate how much conformity is required before conformity itself becomes the enemy of the organization, starts decreasing the effectiveness of the organization. Because if everybody is saying yes, you're not getting the good ideas you need to advance, right? So, to go back to that sentence, organizational cultures at work, and define them, an organization is based on existing meanings, but also creates new ones. That is the nature of an organization in modern, or I should say postmodern times. IBM, white shirts, no other color but. Then they permitted light blue shirts. Then they permitted longer hair, but it had to be neatly styled. Microsoft suddenly permitted sneakers. Sneakers at work? Good Lord, they'd never seen before. Suddenly, these techies are wearing sneakers. Look at Steve Jobs, the way he used to dress to go to work. All this change came from the organization as it recreated itself, the subcultures. So we can say that there was a cultural shift in our organizational society, and a shift that did not get rid of that sentence that we ask each other in North America, anyways. It'll never be asked in France. What do you do? Always that. How do you do is followed by what do you do? This interest in the professional activity of the other. The democratic organization of the 70s and beyond becomes an organization culture supposedly taking care of the needs of its workers. And these needs become legislation, maternity leave, rules against sexual harassment. I mean, Mad Men doesn't show everything, believe me. I couldn't believe when I first worked in companies how often men made sexual remarks to women and the women allowed it and no action was brought. So we have had a lot of legislative changes, minority rights, disability rights, it goes on and on and on. And all of this happened through unions, through organizational struggles, through the organization finally having to take into account the culture values that it operates in and remain true to them. Because if your organization is completely cut off from the institution that is called society, you're not dressed for success. Dressing for success is not just wearing the right clothes. It's having the inner thoughts and emotions that go with success. And we'll talk more about this later on. So this is the end of Lecture 4. Thank you.